Hello and welcome to a new episode of Markets and Morality, the IA show where we explore contradicting opinions within the classical liberal free market tent. I will be your host, Adam Bartha, the head of international relations here at the IA. But today's discussion will be quite UK focused because most European countries have compulsory identification documents. So the question of voter IDs would not arise on the continent at all. Although there is no talk about introducing compulsory IDs here in the UK, but the government recently introduced an elections bill that would make some sort of voter ID compulsory for voting in general elections across the UK. There was an immediate uproar, not just on the opposition benches, but in many segments of the civil society as well. Labour accused the bill of being full of solutions in search of problems and said that it's rather looking to open up democracy and greater participation, which the bill does not. Government ministers defended their stance by stating that voter IDs are supported by the Electoral Commission and that they are backed by international elections observers who have been repeatedly calling for the introduction because they are saying that their absence is a security risk. So today, we will be discussing whether classical liberals should support the introduction of voter IDs. And I have the pleasure to welcome two great thinkers to the discussion, one of them who seems to agree with Labour in this particular regard at least, and the other who supports the government's motion on this occasion. Mark Johnson, the legal and policy officer of Big Brother Watch, will argue against the introduction of voter IDs. Mark is focusing on the freedom of expression, policing, and technologies at Big Brother Watch, and he has worked in parliament, party politics, and public affairs before. Victoria Hewson will take a less skeptical stance on the government's election bill. She is the head of regulatory affairs here at the IA and a professional lawyer who practiced for 12 years in the fields of technology and financial services. Before she was part of the IA, she was at the Legatum Institute's Special Trade Commission, focusing on trade and regulatory policy. Victoria, Mark, it's great to have you guys both on board.
Thank you very much.
Let's start the discussion from a theoretical angle rather than a practical one. So Mark, voting is currently automatically extended to citizens only, right? It's one per citizen, one vote. So isn't it normal to expect that this right is only exercised by those who have it in a manner in accordance with the law? And if so, shouldn't we have some sort of a process in place that ensures this?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. We're very, very lucky in this country to have a voting system that is safe and secure, and also one which commands public confidence across the board. And that's largely because we do actually have a rigorous voter registration system. So when somebody goes to vote, their identity is checked against DWP records predominantly. And then, as you point out, it's one person, one vote. And that's not the only reason why people have such confidence in our voting system here in the UK, or the running of elections here in the UK. It's also that the system, as it works at the moment, is pretty watertight, and we're very fortunate that in the system that we have, there have actually only been 3 counts of voter fraud by personation since 2014. And I think based on that, more than anything else, it's clear that there's no necessity to bring in a system of voter ID. And I think it's really incumbent on states, particularly democratic states, to ensure that the barriers to voting, which is such a fundamental right in a democracy, are as low as possible. And introducing something like voter ID would create additional barriers which are not necessary based on that evidence.
Sure. And Victoria, from your perspective, you and I usually agree, and other free marketeers usually agree, that the papers, please mentality is quite harmful. So what's different with voter IDs? Isn't it just an additional layer of bureaucracy that we usually tend to despise so much?
There certainly is some indication that the way the government is pursuing this is actually rather unnecessary. the government's own explanation of the policy sort of admits that there's only anecdotal evidence that this kind of fraud of what's called personation, turning up and voting fraudulently, taking someone else's vote in person at the polling station. So I'm not 100% convinced, slightly undermining my own argument here, I'm not 100% convinced at all that this bill is necessary. And frankly, the fact that the Electoral Commission supports it actually makes me even more inclined to oppose it. However, to your point about the principle here, the act of voting is something that you do in your capacity as yourself. It's a purely personal right that attaches to you. It's not fungible to anyone else, and it matters that you are who you are when you do it. So it's in a different category from activities like going to a shop or using public transport or going to a football match or any of these other activities where there has been the potential or even the execution of, say, vaccine passports and other sorts of requirements to somehow prove your status. I think it's different to them because, as I say, voting attaches to you as a person. It's a bit like when you go to the post office to collect a parcel if you've missed the delivery. I think it's reasonable for the post office to require you to prove that you are who you say you are, so that they don't just hand out parcels to anyone who turns up speculatively to ask for one who might happen to know your name and address. And I think that's sort of a fair analogy, and that's why I'm not opposed to requiring voter ID in principle. However, that is something quite different, as I say, to accepting that it's actually necessary, because almost aesthetically, I quite like the idea that we don't have to show ID to go and vote. I think it sends a nice, almost nostalgic sign of a trustful society, and in a way, it will be a shame to lose that.
So both of you seem to agree that from a very practical perspective, basically the consequences of not having a voter ID at the moment are not great. But Mark, you have mentioned that if there were a voter ID and if the legislation actually passes, and there might be some unintended consequences of introducing them. Would you mind elaborating a bit more what kind of unintended consequences or practical consequences the introduction of voter IDs might have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in this country already, we have around 9 million people who are not on the electoral register. And on top of that, there are something between 2 and 3 million people who don't carry a form of ID at all. And there's no necessity for them to do so if they don't want to do so. Some of these people may be locked out of the system in other ways. They might be from some of the more marginalized communities. But what bringing in mandatory voter ID would have the potential to do would be to lock them out of the electoral system. And where I kind of disagree in a way with what Victoria said is that because voting is so important, that's why we shouldn't introduce something like this in this arena, because we need to lower the barrier as much as we can. We need to get as many people to vote. That's commonly understood as a good thing in democracies, to try and raise the turnout and create a legitimacy to the result of elections. And so we want to create a system that is as easy to participate in as possible. And the danger with voter ID is that those people who don't have documentation, the people that are not voting already, will actually be turned away. And looking at voter ID trials that took place in 2018 and 2019, that has been the case when they've been piloted.
You mentioned that one of the goals in a liberal democracy should be to lower the barriers to vote. Just purely on a philosophical basis, I think some classical liberals would disagree with that statement. Some classical liberals even propose that maybe there should be an introduction of some sort of citizenship test in order for people to attend and vote. So is necessarily raising the barriers to vote a problem from a classical liberal perspective?
I think this kind of goes to the very heart of the debate, which is, you say you say that creating some kind of entry requirement to voting, is a proposition amongst some people. Obviously, I fundamentally reject that idea, but perhaps a less serious version of that is creating a license to be able to vote. That's what we're doing here. In effect, we're saying you are licensed by the state to vote, and I don't agree with the premise of either of those points. Unsurprisingly, on the first, but also on the second, as citizens in a free liberal democracy, the way that I see it is that we devolve our power up to the state. It's our elections to command. It's our country to govern, in effect, and we shouldn't have to be permitted to vote by those that are in power already. We grant them the power through our ability to vote and be active citizens in a liberal democracy. So unsurprisingly, I disagree with the first, but it's almost in a similar vein that I disagree with the second as well.
Sure. And let's assume there is 100% agreement that lowering the barriers to vote is a goal, but we also want to make sure that there is no electoral fraud going on. What do you both think about the idea of introducing an ID system that's already prevalent in most continental European countries, where you don't need to apply for government identification documents, you just get it when you turn 18 or you get it through birth? Victoria, would you be in support of introducing not just voter IDs, but actual IDs across the UK?
No, quite strongly not. I must admit that part of that is a sort of almost emotional attachment to an ID-free or mandatory ID-free society, because that does have connotations of trustfulness and that the state, that we don't live in a society where we need the state's permission, or that we are somehow required to prove our right to be in any particular situation or context at any particular time. However, I am perhaps more in favour of the state making it possible for people to identify themselves more easily when they do need to do so for legitimate purposes. So, for example, I don't know if either of you have tried to do something like either rent a car online or apply for a mortgage. Both things that I've been doing recently, where you have to prove your ID in order to satisfy money laundering rules and that kind of thing. And obviously security reasons if you're trying to hire a car. And the processes are quite painful. You have to take a selfie of yourself holding your passport up. And I'd be quite relaxed about the government. And in fact, the government is doing this, about the government working on a sort of technical standard for digital ID that then service providers could make that available to people, so that they had that available to identify themselves easily when they validly needed to do so. But I think that's a slightly separate question to whether the state should then have the power to demand and require that you do identify yourself in normal activities and interactions, if that makes any sense. So I think having identity available to people as a service for when they need to identify themselves is fine, but the state mandating that you either take up those methods of identifying yourself or mandate that you identify yourself in more and more civil interactions, I'd be very strongly against.
Sure. So basically no introduction of a national ID, but some sort of a system where private providers can make it easier for citizens to prove their own identity. If it's in the hand of private providers, are you not worried about some of the privacy issues and some of the cybersecurity issues that might be linked to it?
To be honest, I would trust private providers on that far more than I would trust the government to be able to run a secure private service. And but this, the same risk goes with everything that we do. And in fact, I would have a lot more faith that an encrypted, secure digital ID was going to be less susceptible to being being hacked or stolen in some way than me texting a photograph of myself holding my passport.
How about you, Mark? Would you support a national ID system, or would you actually be in favor of some sort of private providers helping with the identification process?
You probably won't be surprised to know that, given my work for Big Brother Watch, that I don't support a national ID system. I think the idea of a national ID card or a national ID system speaks to the kind of society that you live in, and one where you either are effectively a serial number, and again, this is about the state giving you a kind of license to exist, or one where you don't need that, and where you're a free, autonomous individual person that devolves your power up to the state rather than the other way around. I understand that for access in some sectors and services, there might be a requirement to have some kind of ID, and that's why existing options should be accessible to people, and part of the reason sometimes why people might not have ideas because they can be expensive for people on lower incomes. But the idea of a kind of like mandated national system is one which I would naturally be very opposed to.
And how about the private version of it? Do you think that these tech companies or these private providers would be able to help with the identification process? Because in theory, your ID sounds great, right? We are free and autonomous citizens who are kind of handing over the powers to our collective governments. But in practice, there are already many processes in place, like NHS numbers and the like, that force us to identify ourselves vis-a-vis the states and other citizens and other businesses. So isn't there already kind of a more inconvenient system in place that's instead of a national ID system? And if so, we are just lacking convenience, but we encounter the same kind of problems in our everyday lives.
I think that you're right in some ways, that there are lots of different identifiers that people rely on for goods and services and so on. But I think the idea of centralizing them, whether it's a public or a private model, is still something to be quite wary of. And naturally, I'm always slightly allergic to large centralized databases, whoever runs them. So
I would say that that is sort of what my idea, and in fact the ideas that are being pursued, is that it's decentralized. You don't have a single database of everyone's ID. You have a set of technical standards that a plurality of providers can use in order to have the necessary trust to that the person who needs to see the verified ID can trust that this is a verified provider to do it. And I think the great benefit of that is that it is decentralized, and you don't have this single central government or otherwise database of everybody's ID. Dare I use the fatal words blockchain, and those kinds of solutions are actually quite useful in these scenarios because they are decentralized and highly secure.
Sure. So if you had to advise the MPs on how to vote, I assume that it's pretty obvious from both of your parts that some of you would prefer a yes vote, one of you would prefer a no vote. But is there kind of an international example out there where you would think, okay, this is the system that works the best because electoral fraud is incredibly low, the barriers to vote are equally low, and the system in general works well? Or if there is no international example, is kind of the UK the unique unicorn that other countries should be following?
I would actually say the UK probably is the example country that I would have used to answer that question, which isn't to say that we don't have some issues with electoral fraud. The big sort of scandal and incident of fraud was the famous Tower Hamlets situation a few years ago. And the great irony is that the proposals in the legislation that's being put forward would do absolutely nothing to address the real and significant electoral fraud that we have seen happening. And I'm pretty sure that postal voting is very susceptible to fraud as well. That's the slightly disappointing thing. And I don't entirely understand why the government is pursuing the voter ID. I suppose it's some kind of political gesture to say they're doing something about electoral fraud to make people feel better. And I would say as well, to Mark's earlier point, I am in favour of addressing electoral fraud issues, including personation, if it were a real problem, because while I accept all of Mark's points about the importance of wide participation in elections for underpinning legitimacy and so on, I think it's also the case that electoral fraud does delegitimize democratic processes. And if someone, for every fraudulent vote that's cast, that essentially cancels out a valid vote by someone else. So that's why, in principle, I could potentially be in favour of voter ID. Yeah, I think aside from all of that, I think the UK system is actually pretty good and pretty well respected internationally.
Mark, do you agree with Victoria's statement? Is the UK the example to follow globally?
I think so. I mean, as I said at the very start, I'm quite confident that, voting in the UK is safe and secure, and we're very lucky that confidence is high in our system, and that's really important to ensure that we have good turnouts at elections. But on that point about delegitimizing the result, I guess one of the important things here is when you are creating a policy that will in some way kind of infringe upon a fundamental right, in this case the right to vote, you have to have a solid evidence base to make sure that it's justified and proportionate. And in this case, when we know that the number of counts of voter fraud by personation is 3 over the last 8 years, it's not clear that the evidence base is there, and the risk is that what will happen is that the number of people that will not be able to vote as a result of creating those additional barriers would delegitimize the result in a different way, rather than deal with small numbers of personation on a case-by-case basis with the full weight of the law. What you would do would be actually drive down turnout and stop citizens who have a right to vote from doing so.
Victoria, Mark, thank you for a great discussion. I'm sure that the MPs will be watching and listening with eager eyes, and hopefully so will the Lords, who will be further debating the elections bill and the introduction of voter IDs in the near future. Many thanks to our dear viewers as well. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section or on Twitter @ILondon. Also, special thanks to our donors, without whom our work at the Eye would not be possible. If you wish to contribute and support our work, please do consider subscribing to the Eye Patreon account, where you can receive some exclusive content and have a sneak peek into the behind-the-scenes work as well. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you in 2 weeks' time again.